The Pixar Touch, The Making of a Company, by David A. Price. Narrated by David Drummond. Copyright 2008 by David A. Price. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with David A. Price and writers' representatives and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Chapter 1. Anaheim. Like much of Southern California, the place where John Lasseter was standing had been part of an orange grove only 50 years before. The morning of March 10, 2006, Lasseter was on stage at the Arrowhead Pond Arena in Anaheim, the venue of the Walt Disney Company's annual shareholder meeting. In front of him was an audience of 4,000 or so investors, ranging from retirees to young parents who had brought along their children. A couple of miles to the west was Disneyland, itself built on a former orange grove. Lasseter had worked there during summer breaks in college, first as a sweeper in Tomorrowland, whisking away candy wrappers and popcorn, and later as a guide on the Jungle Cruise. About 20 miles to the north was Whittier, his childhood hometown. There he'd started his professional art career at the age of 5 with a crayon drawing that won him $15 in a contest at a local market. A bit farther, around 45 minutes up Interstate 5, was the old Disney Animation Building in Burbank, where he'd worked as a junior animator some 22 years ago. Lasseter presented a strikingly laid-back appearance, as usual. He wore blue jeans and tennis shoes. His wireless mic peeked out from beneath the collar of a Hawaiian-style print shirt. Between his attire and his round cherubic face, it was hard to remember that he was a 49-year-old senior executive of a company that had just been bought for $7.4 billion. The past half-dozen years, under former Chief Executive Officer Michael D. Eisner, Disney had set its shareholder meetings in a series of cold-weather cities during cold-weather months. The 2005 meeting had been held in Minneapolis in February, all the better, many suspected, to discourage attendance by the company's increasingly restless shareholders. This year, however, there was no need for such ruses. In October 2005, Chief Operating Officer Robert Iger had replaced the divisive Eisner as CEO. On taking the helm, Iger had quickly carried out a bold stroke, negotiating a buyout of Pixar Animation Studios. Although the price was high, the acquisition had proven to be overwhelmingly popular. The deal was the culmination of one of the great reversals of fortune in business history. Pixar had started life 20 years earlier, not as Pixar Animation Studios, but as Pixar Incorporated, a computer hardware company, one of hundreds dotting the landscape of the San Francisco Bay Area. A tiny animation group, consisting of Lasseter and a few technical guys, made short promotional films that brought in zero revenue. The group came close more than once to being shut down. When the Pixar image computer proved unprofitable, the company turned to selling animation software and making animated commercials for the likes of Listerine and Lifesavers. It kept running losses year after year. In 1991, when Disney agreed to finance the production of Pixar's first feature film for theatrical release, Disney had all but dictated the terms of their contract. In late 1993, Disney ordered Pixar to shut down production of the Lasseter-directed film Toy Story on account of script problems, leaving Pixar's management and staff to wonder whether there would ever be a Pixar feature film at all. Many in Hollywood wondered whether audiences would even sit through a full-length film in the new medium of computer animation. It was unclear whether computer animation would prove to be a sterile novelty that would quickly wear thin. Before long, however, Pixar was no longer the supplicant. A succession of beloved and commercially successful feature films, starting with the 1995 release of Toy Story, and also including A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters Incorporated, Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles, made Pixar the world's dominant animation studio. Disney made a fortune distributing the films. When Pixar's majority owner and CEO, Steve Jobs, cut off contract talks with Disney in early 2004, as the end of their distribution contract was in sight, the business press focused on the question of how Disney would cope. By then, it was Disney that seemed to need Pixar. The distribution of Pixar's films made up around 45% of the operating income from Disney's film operations. Disney's internal market research showed that mothers of young children trusted the Pixar brand more than Disney's. With the acquisition, Lasseter was soon to hold the newly confected titles of Chief Creative Officer for Disney and Pixar Animation and Principal Creative Advisor for Disney's worldwide theme parks and resorts. The success of Pixar's films had brought him something exceedingly rare in Hollywood. Not the house with the obligatory pool in the backyard and the Oscar statuettes on the fireplace mantel, or the country estate, or the vintage Jaguar Roadster, although he had all of those things too. It wasn't that he could afford to indulge his affinity for model railroads by acquiring a full-size 1901 steam locomotive, with plans to run it on the future site of his 20,000-square-foot mansion in Sonoma Valley wine country. Even Walt Disney's backyard train had been a mere 1/8 scale replica. None of these was the truly important fruit of Lasseter's achievements. What success had brought him, most meaningfully, was freedom. Having created a new genre of film with his colleagues at Pixar, he had been able to make the films he wanted to make, and he was coming back to Disney on his own terms. Lasseter was on hand that morning in Anaheim to whip up enthusiasm for the acquisition and for Pixar's forthcoming films, Cars and Ratatouille. Iger had teased the audience earlier in the morning with a bit of misdirection, pretending to build up to an introduction of Lasseter and then changing the subject. When Iger was finally ready to bring him on, Lasseter met with energetic applause and whooping and yelling as the sound system played a few bars of the signature song of Toy Story and Toy Story 2, You've Got a Friend in Me. When Lasseter speaks on stage, his exuberant gestures and delivery make it seem as if he's filling the room. His voice, although slightly nasal, is still warm and appealing. For the Disney stockholders meeting, my wife said, "You've got to dress up, John," he began. So I wore black tennis shoes. The crowd laughed and gave him another smattering of applause. He recalled his high school afternoons, running home to catch Bugs Bunny cartoons on Channel 11. He told of finding the book The Art of Animation by Bob Thomas and realizing that some people actually earned a living from making cartoons. "That's what I wanted to be," he said. He remembered working on the Jungle Cruise ride and the corny bits of comedy that the ride operators tossed off to enliven the show. Elsewhere, he had told friends that the experience brought him out of his shell and gave him confidence in front of people. Apparently, it worked. "My favorite joke is, remember the natives that are on the pole and the rhino was there? You'd come up and say, 'Oh, there they are, it's the famous Huntus tribe. They've been lost for a long time. Oh, look, the rhino is trying to Pocahontas.'" He recounted joining Disney's animation division fresh out of the California Institute of the Arts and seeing one of the early trials of 3D computer animation. "I knew that Walt would have loved this," he said. He elided over the disappointment he'd felt as a young man in trying and failing to get the studio to embrace the new technology. Keeping his presentation upbeat, he said simply, "So I followed my dream to work with one of the most amazing people I've ever known in my life, Ed Catmull." The 61-year-old president of Pixar, Dr. Edwin Catmull, looking on from the audience, was a computer graphics researcher who had fallen accidentally into the role of business leader. With his salt-and-pepper beard and round gold-rimmed glasses, he still resembled an academic. He was a geeks geek who routinely brought scientific books and papers with him on vacation as recreational reading. Those who knew him well invariably described him as brilliant, but his intelligence was not the kind that advertised itself by dominating conversations. By and large, he preferred listening to talking. When he did speak, his words were genial and courtly. While Catmull had built upon the work of others, the revolution in 3D animation was in many respects his revolution. It was Catmull who had held to his youthful vision of fully computer-animated movies. It was Catmull, running computer graphics labs at the New York Institute of Technology and George Lucas's Lucasfilm, who had assembled the technical and creative teams that would become the core of Pixar Animation Studios. In 1986, Steve Jobs bought us from Lucasfilm, and we formed Pixar, Lasseter went on. For the first 10 years, we lost a lot of Steve's money. A lot of Steve's money. Steve Jobs was missing from the scene of the meeting, though he would soon be Disney's largest individual shareholder. The acquisition was a stock-for-stock trade, and the newest member of Disney's board. Lasseter was right about his money. Jobs had driven a hard bargain in buying Lucas's computer division for $5 million, not $10 million, as is sometimes reported, but as it turned out, he put 10 times that amount into the company over the course of a decade to keep it afloat. Few other investors would have had the patience of Jobs. Lasseter continued by relating his affection for all things Disney and showing off footage from Cars and Ratatouille. He closed by bringing his story full circle. He was proud, he said, to come home to Disney again. Listening to Lasseter's presentation in its full sweep, one could recognize in it the cadences of a Pixar film, stretches of adventure narrative and comedy punctuated by moments of disarming earnestness, all capped by the inevitable happy ending. With the benefit of hindsight, Pixar's success story does seem inevitable. The studio enjoyed an unprecedented 6 box office triumphs in a row during its years as an independent company, turning out hits with clock-like regularity, and it would continue its winning streak under Disney's wing. Yet Pixar's story was anything but preordained. It is a triple helix of artistic, technological, and business struggles, and it is a study in the tremendously uncertain and contingent nature of artistic, technological, and business success. It illustrates how professional prestige and social status flow into each other, and how a small organization can magnify its power by deploying them as an economic force. It shows how small things done well can lead to big things. It is the story of a small group of individuals who started with a shared ambition to create a new way of telling stories within a virtual world of mathematical constructions, and who traveled a long and circuitous road until their vision became a reality. Just as Pixar's success was far from preordained, neither was the success of any of its leading figures. Indeed, one of the curious aspects of Pixar's story is that each of its leaders was, by conventional standards, a failure at the time he came onto the scene. Lasseter landed his dream job at Disney out of college and had just been fired from it. Catmull had done well-respected work as a graduate student in computer graphics, but had been turned down for a teaching position and ended up in what he felt was a dead-end software development job. Alvy Ray Smith, the company's co-founder, had checked out of academia, got work at Xerox's famous Palo Alto Research Center, and then abruptly found himself on the street. Jobs had endured humiliation and pain as he was ejected from Apple Computer, the company he had co-founded. Overnight, he had transformed from boy wonder of Silicon Valley to a roundly ridiculed has-been. For each of these figures, one could say that failure rewarded him by opening the way to new and ultimately grander outlets for his ambitions. The odysseys of these figures, and of Pixar as a whole, bring to mind the observation of the maverick economist Joseph Schumpeter that successful innovation is a feat not of intellect, but of will. Writing about the psychology of entrepreneurs in the early 20th century, a time when the subject was unfashionable, he believed few individuals are prepared for the resistances and uncertainties incident to doing what has not been done before. Those who braved the risks of failure did so out of non-economic as well as economic motives, among them the joy of creating, of getting things done, or simply of exercising one's energy and ingenuity. In Pixar's case, at least, the resistances and uncertainties were abundant, as was the will. The story begins as a soft-spoken, straight-laced former missionary named Ed Catmull enters graduate school at the University of Utah in 1970. At the time, the discipline of 3D computer animation is still an orange grove. Chapter 2. In the Garage. Now and then in history, one finds a time and a place that seems to be charmed, where talent has assembled in a way that appears to defy all laws of probability. Drama in Elizabethan London, philosophy in Athens during the 3rd century BC, painting in late 15th century and early 16th century Florence. One of the lesser known among these is Salt Lake City in the 1960s and early 1970s. To be more precise, computer graphics at the University of Utah Computer Science Department. Ed Catmull came of age professionally in this milieu, and his career would for decades to come show Utah's influence on both his ambitions and his managerial style. The university had recruited Dave Evans, a computer science professor at Berkeley and an elder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to start its computer science department in 1965. Evans, in turn, recruited other top researchers to join the faculty, most notably a 30-year-old tenured Harvard professor named Ivan Sutherland. For his doctoral thesis at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Sutherland had developed a system called Sketchpad, path-breaking for its time, that allowed users to sketch black-and-white engineering drawings with a light pen and a computer display. It wasn't just that Sutherland's system let a person draw with a computer, which was mind-blowing enough. At a time when users stood in line to drop punch card programs into a card reader, the better to meter out the computer's precious milliseconds, Sketchpad relied on the insane idea of letting one person use a room-sized computer all by himself. Equipment for computer graphics could not be bought off the shelf in the late 1960s, so Evans and Sutherland also started a company to build and sell it. Consequently, researchers at Utah always had the latest top-of-the-line graphics hardware. Money flooded into the department from ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, a unit of the Pentagon created in response to Sputnik to fund research on next-generation technologies. Computer graphics was a small field, and the word spread that Utah was the place to go. Evans, uninterested in the hierarchy and formalities of graduate education, wanted students undertaking their own research as soon as possible. The more daring the objective, the better. He and his colleagues gave graduate students autonomy and respected them as professionals, treating them as top-flight researchers who just happened not to have PhDs yet. The result was an environment in which it was not unusual for students to achieve major advances. Henri Gouraud, a young Frenchman, came to Utah's department and developed a superior way to calculate the shading of curved three-dimensional objects, one that made the objects look far smoother than had been possible before. The Vietnamese-born Bui Tuong Phong came to Utah and was the first to conceive a method for creating objects with realistic-looking illumination and highlights. Gouraud shading and Phong lighting are still used in graphic software today. Other doctoral students of the period would go on to play key roles in the development of computer graphics and in laying the foundations of modern personal computers. The list of names reads like a Homeric roll call. Alan Kay, Ph.D. 1969, would conceive, among other things, object-oriented programming and the point-and-click graphical user interface, both of them now ubiquitous. He would advocate in the early 1970s for the bizarre, as it seemed at the time, concept of a notebook-sized computer that you could carry around with you. John Warnock, Ph.D. 1969, would do pioneering work with digital typefaces and desktop publishing, leading to his co-founding Adobe Systems. Jim Clark, Ph.D. 1974, wrote his thesis on virtual reality displays, founded Silicon Graphics to build computers for high-speed 3D graphics, and co-founded Netscape at the dawn of the era of the World Wide Web. Nolan Bushnell, an undergraduate, B.S. 1969, would go on to start Atari and popularize video games. Another Dave Evans recruit on the faculty, Tom Stockham, would pioneer both digital enhancement of photographs and digital sound recording. Catmull entered this Athens more or less by circumstance. He was a local boy out of Granite High School across town. Born on March 31, 1945, in Parkersburg, West Virginia, he had grown up in Salt Lake City, the oldest of 5 children in a Mormon family. He had come to the university as an undergraduate in 1963, interrupting his college years to go on the 2-year missionary experience that was customary for young Mormon men. The church sent him to Coney Island and Scarsdale, New York. The interruption proved to be providential indeed. He returned to campus just as the computer science program was getting underway. Alan Kay, then a graduate student, taught Catmull's first programming course. Kay remembered Catmull for his habit of going beyond the call of an assignment for fun. He just liked to program, and usually would add things to the assignments that he thought about along the way, Kay said. This is always a good sign. After graduating in 1969 with a degree in computer science and physics, Catmull took a job at Boeing, but was soon caught up in a mass layoff along with thousands of other employees. He came back to the department as a doctoral student with a radical idea. He had aspired in his youth to be a Disney animator. As a boy, he looked up to Walt Disney and made flipbooks in preparation for what he assumed would be his future career in cartoons. In high school, however, he had ruefully concluded that he couldn't draw. Now the thought seized him, computers might allow him to do animation after all. With computer graphics, he could create not just individual images, but feature-length animated films. Computer animation was sort of on the lunatic fringe at that time, said Fred Park, a fellow PhD student in Catmull's class who also worked on animation. People were just barely to the point where they could get a computer to put out still images. It was obvious that it would take years for the state-of-the-art in computer hardware to catch up with his ambition, and there was no end of problems to be solved on the mathematical and programming side. Nonetheless, from Catmull's point of view, there was no better time or place to get started than right here and now. In 1972, Catmull took the opportunity to make a short animated clip for a graduate course project. He decided to digitize and animate the closest thing at hand, his left hand. Nothing about the film came easily or simply. He began by making a plaster of Paris mold of his hand. When he pulled the mold away, the hair on the back of the hand came out painfully with it. He then made a plaster model from the mold and drew about 350 small triangles and other polygons on the model in ink. When he was done, the drawings of the polygons crisscrossed the plaster hand like a net. Just as one could approximate a curved line with a series of short straight lines, a curved object could be represented by a mesh of polygons. Digital counterparts of these polygons would represent the surface of his hand in the computer. He laboriously measured the coordinates of each of the corner points of the polygons and typed them into the computer with a teletype keyboard. With a 3D animation program that he wrote, he could reproduce the disembodied hand on a screen and make it move. Just getting a look at his imagery was a task in itself. Because the display hardware never showed the entire image on screen at any one moment, it took 30 seconds or so to cycle through the image. Catmull could see a frame of his work only by taking a long exposure Polaroid of the screen and looking at the snapshot. Once he was satisfied, he then shot the footage using a 35mm movie camera that the department had rigged to take pictures from a CRT screen. The resulting film, roughly a minute long, was jaw-dropping in its day. It showed the hand swiveling, opening, and closing, and then, the pièce de résistance, the film took the viewer up and into the inside of the hand and looked around. Park created a computer animation of his wife's face at around the same time. The two films defined the cutting edge of computer animation for years afterward. Snippets of both films were also incorporated into the now little-remembered 1976 film Future World. Professor Sutherland opened up a line of communication with the Walt Disney Company to see whether Disney could be persuaded to use computer graphics in its production process for traditional animation. Knowing of Catmull's enthusiasm for animation, Sutherland brought Catmull to Disney to meet with executives there. Disney management wasn't interested in computer graphics, but invited Catmull to help the Disney Imagineering team use computers to design a new ride, specifically Space Mountain, a roller coaster ride planned for the Walt Disney World complex that had just opened in Orlando, Florida. Catmull begged off, and the two men went back to Salt Lake City. Catmull's thesis project had him tackling three-dimensional curves once again. He was interested in bicubic patches, a mathematical way to represent curved surfaces that was smoother than a polygon mesh with all its edges. He figured out how a computer could decide which parts of an object created from bicubic patches should be visible to the viewer and which parts were hidden from view because they were behind something else. It was one of those problems in computer graphics that sound easy in principle but turn out to be very hard in practice. Catmull's solution to the hidden surface problem relied on an invention he called the Z-buffer, an area of memory that kept track of the distance between the viewer and the closest surface at each point of a scene. His work on bicubic patches and the Z-buffer was groundbreaking in itself, yet his thesis had still another major discovery in store. As an offshoot of his fiddling with the mathematics of curved objects, he found a way to project an image, any image, onto an object's exterior. With this invention, known as texture mapping, an object in a computer graphic could be given an appearance of marble, say, or a wood grain finish. His first texture map was a projection of Mickey Mouse onto an undulating surface. In his dissertation, he illustrated the concept with a projection of Winnie the Pooh and Tigger. The trifecta of accomplishments in Catmull's 1974 doctoral thesis, bicubic patches, the Z-buffer, and texture mapping, would have ensured him lasting fame in the field of computer graphics even if he had never done anything else. In his mind, though, they were just stepping stones to his real goal, namely, computer-animated feature films. The path forward for a newly graduated computer graphics specialist was not well marked. Neither academia nor corporate America, nor, of course, the entertainment industry, was hiring battalions of people with Catmull's expertise. Catmull was turned down for a faculty position at Ohio State University, which had a small computer animation effort underway. He then put his hopes on a new project of Professor Sutherland, who had just gone to Hollywood to start a second firm, a production company for computer animation called the Picture Design Group. Its goal was to create computer-animated footage on assignment to be incorporated into commercials, television shows, and films. Catmull waited in Utah while Sutherland and his partners sought investors. By this time, Catmull had a wife, Lorraine, and a 2-year-old son depending on him. Months went by without a job opening up for him at Sutherland's company, and finally the Picture Design Group shut down altogether. Practicality prevailed, and Catmull accepted a programming job in Boston with a company called Applicon. The company made software for computer-aided design, an area far from Catmull's interests. The graphics work at Applicon was based on line drawing, not the solid 3D geometry and shading that Catmull cared about. Character animation, of course, was well off the company's agenda. At the age of 29, he was distressed to find himself simply marking time, doing what he perceived to be dull, routine work, yet unsure what direction to go. This had continued for several months when he received a puzzling phone call at the office. On the line was a secretary for someone he had never heard of. She was calling to set up Catmull's airline ticket to New York, she told him. "I had no idea who the woman was or why she was trying to get me to New York," Catmull recalled. Unknown to Catmull, an eccentric multimillionaire had appeared on the scene back in Salt Lake City. Alexander Schur, a successful entrepreneur, had founded a university called the New York Institute of Technology in 1955. Schur was its president. Lately, Schur had been bitten by the movie-making bug and had opened an animation studio on one of the school's campuses on Long Island. Watching the animators at work, he was struck by the amount of costly hand labor involved and came to believe that computers could replace most of the people. Catmull's animated hand, plus the animated face of Mrs. Fred Park, was now part of a promotional reel for Dave Evans and Ivan Sutherland's hardware company, Evans & Sutherland. An enterprising salesman for E&S had been making cold calls on East Coast universities and had struck gold when he gave a copy of the film to Schur. Soon, Schur was in Utah meeting with Professor Evans and Professor Sutherland and buying one of every kind of equipment they had to offer. In the course of the shopping extravaganza, Evans asked Shore who was going to run his computer graphics operation. "Who should it be?" Shore asked in return.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?